The scent of wilted jasmine lingered faintly in the old kitchen. Harriet stood motionless, her hand trembling over the teacup she hadn't yet lifted to her lips. On the table, light spilled through the window, falling across the scratched wooden surface. Her daughter's words still echoed in her mind, sharp and cold as a blade gliding across skin. "You only stain this family." Each word landed with chilling precision. No shouting, no tears, just Natalie's calm, detached tone, yet it left Harriet gasping for air. The daughter she once cradled in her arms on a stormy night now looked at her as if she were a stain to be wiped away. Harriet tried to speak, but her throat went dry. The ticking clock on the wall seemed to stop, or maybe she could no longer hear it. Only the slow, heavy thud of her heartbeat remained, falling like stones into a deep well. In that moment, an image flickered before her eyes. A dark room. The scent of jasmine rising from the collar of a man who stood with his back turned. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "If anyone asks, don't tell." Then silence. Only the sound of a door closing, the same sound Harriet had heard in her dreams for 30 years. She startled. The kitchen returned to the present. A handkerchief embroidered with the letter N lay before her, its corner frayed, as if it had once been gripped too tightly. Harriet touched it. The fabric felt cold as water. When Natalie was little, she used to tuck that handkerchief into her mother's pocket each morning before work. "So I'll remember you, Mom." Now it lay here again, in the empty space she left behind. Harriet walked to the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall late in the season, quiet and slow. Her daughter was gone, taking with her a gaze colder than winter itself. A drop fell onto the table tear or condensation. Harriet couldn't tell. In her mind, old memories rose again like fragments pulled from the bottom of a lake. A night, a knock at the door, a man in a black raincoat, a damp, smudged piece of paper, and Natalie, only 8 years old then, trembling as she asked, "Mom, where's Dad?" Harriet didn't answer. She never did, because that man had said, "Don't let anyone know." The house was empty now. On the table, the tea had gone cold, leaving a faint yellow ring around the rim. Harriet stared at it, as if within it she could see her daughter's face reflected back. She wanted to call out, to explain that things weren't what they seemed, but her lips wouldn't move. Her hand tightened around the handkerchief, and for the first time in years, Harriet heard the clock begin to tick again, tick-tock. Each beat brought back a memory, each sound, a fragment of lost time. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the door. The scent of jasmine filled the air once more, thick, familiar, suffocating. Harriet closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, her husband's face appeared dim, but unmistakable in the eyes. He looked at her with sorrow. Then that same voice returned, distant and haunting. "If anyone asks, don't tell." Harriet opened her eyes. The light had shifted late afternoon, pale and silvery. On the table, half hidden beneath the teacup, she noticed an old envelope, its edges browned as if singed by fire. The handwriting on it trembled slightly. "To my daughter." Harriet held the envelope in her hand, her fingers trembling so much that the paper's edge scraped her skin, leaving a faint sting. The words, "to my daughter," had already blurred halfway, as if someone had once touched them with tear-soaked fingers. No stamp, no address, just a thin layer of dust and a scorched corner on the bottom right. She hesitated. For 30 years, Harriet had never opened it. The letter was found in her husband's old coat the night he disappeared. The police said he died in an accident, but she knew that wasn't the whole truth. Using a cake knife, she gently slit the envelope. A yellowed sheet of paper slid out, carrying the faint scent of old ink mixed with jasmine. Harriet inhaled deeply, and her heart sank as she recognized the handwriting of that man. "Natalie, if you're reading this, It means I wasn't able to come home. There are things I've done that you may never understand. But you must know your mother is not to blame. I beg you don't resent her. Trust her, even when she says nothing." The sentences were short, broken, but it took Harriet a long time to read them all. Between each line were long ink smudges, as if the writer had paused in fear or regret. "I promised I would return, but there are people who won't let me live. Don't tell anyone." Harriet laid the letter on the table. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Each word, each line of ink pressed heavily against her chest. For 3 decades, she had lived under the shadow of being the unfaithful wife, the woman who drove her husband to suicide, and Natalie, her only daughter, had grown up surrounded by whispers. "That girl is the daughter of a traitor." Harriet once believed silence would protect her child. But today, when Natalie said, "You only stain this family," she understood. It was that very silence that had nurtured the contempt in her daughter's heart. She looked out the window. The snow was falling harder now. On the glass, snowflakes melted into long streaks like dripping words, just like the ink on the letter. She heard footsteps echo down the hallway. Harriet's heart clenched. But no, it was only the wind slipping through the doorframe. Natalie was gone, and perhaps wouldn't return. Harriet picked up the handkerchief embroidered with N and pressed it to her face. The scent of old fabric, baby shampoo, and jasmine all came flooding back. And memories rushed in, fast and wild like a broken dam. A distant afternoon. Natalie was just 8 years old, running through the garden, her hair damp with dew. Her father stood afar, arms crossed, smiling at her. "She looks so much like you," he said. His voice was low, rough, and those eyes, Harriet had never forgotten them. But then the smile faded. Another man entered the frame of memory tall, wearing a gray overcoat, placing a hand on her husband's shoulder. Harriet couldn't hear what was said, only saw Richard's expression change before he turned away. He left a wedding ring on the table, and the scent of jasmine lingered in the wind. Harriet suddenly opened her eyes. The kitchen returned, but her heart was still racing. The letter still lay before her, its trembling handwriting almost alive. She whispered, as if to herself, "If you knew the truth, would you forgive me?" No one answered. Only the ticking of the clock, steady, cold, echoing in the empty room. Harriet stood up, folded the letter, and slipped it back into the old envelope. She knew this was no longer a secret she could keep. As her hand brushed the teacup, a single drop of water fell from the ceiling and splashed onto the table. Harriet watched the water spread, forming a circle. In the center, her reflection appeared blurred, aged, but in her eyes, a faint light remained, the light of resolve. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "I'll tell you everything." But Harriet didn't know that very night. As she dozed off beside the table, another hand quietly opened the door and took the letter away. The next morning, the house remained silent. Sunlight pierced through the curtains, fine as threads of gold crossing the old wooden floor. Harriet woke up at the table, her neck aching, and the letter was no longer where she'd left it. She blinked, trying to recall had it all been a dream? No, that paper had been real. The handwriting, the jasmine scent, each trembling line unmistakable. But now, only the empty envelope remained on the table, its edge torn, as if someone had yanked it away in the dark. Harriet stood, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The doors were still locked, no signs of forced entry, no unfamiliar footprints, only a drifting breeze, carrying the last chill of winter. She walked toward the framed photo on the wall, the only family portrait left. In it, Richard stood in the middle, his hand resting on Harriet's shoulder, and young Natalie beamed in a white dress. 3 faces, 3 smiles, But Harriet knew it was only a brief moment carved out of years of heaviness. She looked closer. Something made her stop. Near the bottom edge of the glass was a small tear, a scratch running across half of Richard's face. Harriet reached out. The glass was cracked. She took the photo down and carefully removed the worn paper backing. On the reverse side, the edge of the photo was torn, as if someone had once tried to hide part of the image. She turned it over. There were a few words written in fountain pen, the ink smeared. "She knows." Just 2 words. Brief. But Harriet felt a chill crawl across her skin. Who wrote that? And who was she? Was it Harriet? Or was it Natalie? Harriet clutched the torn photo, her hands trembling. The damaged picture, the strange message, the missing letter, all of it had happened in the same night. She knew now someone was still watching. A sudden knock at the door. Harriet jolted, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. 3 knocks, short, firm, even. She went to open it. A postal worker stood outside and handed her a new white envelope. No return address. Harriet signed, closed the door, and opened it right there in the hallway. Inside was only a single old photograph, the same image she had just held, but in this version, Richard's face was untouched. He was smiling, his arm around another man, the one in the gray coat from Harriet's memory. Along the edge of the photo, someone had written in red ink, "Bell Street, remember?" Harriet almost dropped the picture. Bell Street. That was where they used to live, before moving here, where Richard had disappeared. She took a step back, her fingers unconsciously clutching the handkerchief with the embroidered N in her pocket. The jasmine scent drifted back again. She knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. At that very moment, on the other side of the city, Natalie sat in her office, staring at her phone. She had just opened a message from an unknown number. "Your mother's been hiding something from you. Ask about Bell Street." Natalie looked up, her eyes sharpening. She remembered the sight of Harriet yesterday, hunched over her teacup, hands trembling, concealing something. The cold words she had thrown at her mother now echoed in her head. "You only stain this family." But now those words stung. Harriet had remained silent for years. But if she truly had been hiding something, Natalie needed to know, no matter how dirty the truth might be. Harriet was sitting in the living room when she heard the door lock turn. That sound made her heart pound a reflex, as if something long buried had just risen from memory. Natalie stepped in, rain clinging to her coat, her gaze as cold as glass. "You're home," Harriet said, trying to keep her voice steady. Natalie didn't respond. She walked straight to the wall where the photo had once hung. Only a faded square and floating dust remained. "Where's the picture?" "It cracked. I took it down," Harriet replied, her voice softening. But Natalie had already crossed the room and grabbed the frame from the table, her eyes fixed on the tear across her father's face. "I remember this photo perfectly." "Yes, I was just planning to fix it," Harriet said. Natalie looked at her mother, then gave a dry, knowing smile. "Or were you hiding something in it?" The words dropped into the room like a stone, heavy and sharp. Harriet didn't answer. Her fingers clenched, feeling the cold metal edge of the frame pressing into her palm. The air between them thickened a silence so loud it seemed to echo their heartbeats. "I found this." Natalie reached into her pocket and pulled out the photo the stranger had sent. She placed it on the table, directly in front of her mother. "Do you know anyone in this picture?" Harriet looked down. The light from the window glinted across the image like a blade. Richard and the man in the gray coat. Bell Street. Memories she had tried to bury screamed back. The rain, tires slicing through water, voices strained in hushed arguments. "You don't remember this man?" Natalie's voice rose, sharper. Harriet exhaled. "No, don't lie to me." Natalie cut her off, her tone flat. "Someone sent this to me. They said you've been hiding the truth about Dad." Harriet stepped back, her lips trembling, unable to speak. She knew her silence only made Natalie believe the worst. But how could she explain it all? How could she say the truth hurt more than the lie? "You betrayed him, didn't you?" Natalie said slowly, each word slicing the air. "That's why he left?" Harriet froze. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant, but it felt like the sky had cracked with the weight of that question. The room filled with the scent of damp wood, wilted jasmine, and rain drifting in through a cracked window. "You don't understand," she whispered. Natalie laughed cold, metallic. "Don't understand. You kept the letter, hid the photo, tore Dad's face from the frame. What exactly am I supposed to understand?" Harriet closed her eyes. In her head, her husband's voice echoed again, like a curse. "If anyone asks, don't tell." When she opened them, Natalie had turned away, her arm accidentally knocking the photo frame off the table. Glass shattered. The sound was piercing. Beneath the torn backing, something slipped out, a small piece of paper, folded into quarters, yellowed, the edges singed black. Natalie bent down to pick it up. On it, in shaky handwriting nearly identical to the letter Harriet had read the night before, were the words, "Bell Street, Thursday, don't follow me." Natalie looked at her mother, eyes wide. "This was from Dad, wasn't it?" Harriet couldn't lie. She only nodded. In that moment, Natalie's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed cold. "So you knew where he went. You knew this whole time." Then she turned and walked to the door. The sound of it slamming shut sliced through the air. Harriet collapsed to her knees, picking up the note, her fingers stained with old ink and dust. On the floor, the shattered glass reflected her face, fragmented, layered, distorted. And in the smallest shard, Harriet caught a glimpse of Richard, his smile, and those sad eyes. She whispered, just loud enough for the empty room to hear, "You never really left, did you?" Cold wind curled around the rows of graves. The sound of dry earth falling on the casket echoed dull, heavy, and fading into the fog. Natalie, just 8 years old then, clutched her mother's hand tightly. She didn't cry. She didn't know why. She only sensed a scent lingering in the air, jasmine, tangled in candle smoke, in the breath of grown-ups, in the rain-drenched strands of her mother's hair. "Sweetheart, bow your head," Harriet said, her voice trembling. Natalie obeyed, her eyes resting on the freshly carved headstone, Richard Hale, 1955 to 1992. Beneath the engraving, someone had placed a white flower, jasmine. Its dew-laced petals trembled in the wind. And then Natalie heard it a whisper behind her. Very faint, but sharp enough to slice through layers of wind. "Poor girl. Her mother's the reason her father died." An old woman's voice, brittle and dry. Then another, quicker, and hushed. "Didn't they say she pushed him away? They fought that night." Natalie turned around and saw 2 women in black. Their eyes flicked over to her and Harriet, then dropped, avoiding her gaze. Harriet didn't react or pretended not to. She stood still, eyes hollow, her hand clenched around a paper deep in her coat pocket. Her fingertips had turned pale. As the mourners began to leave, Harriet sat down beside the grave, dry-eyed. Natalie remained standing, the wind sneaking beneath her collar, making her shiver. "Mom, why did they say that?" she asked softly. Harriet didn't answer. She simply placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, squeezing gently. From that hand came the faint scent of jasmine. "Don't listen to them," she whispered. "They don't know anything, but an 8-year-old doesn't believe that." In her heart, the voice of the dead faded, and only the whispers remained. Her mother had caused her father's death. 20 years later. Natalie jolted awake in the middle of the night, heart pounding. She had just dreamt of that scene exactly the same scent, same weight. Jasmine. wet earth. That strange woman's whisper still grazed her ears like an old wound refusing to close. She turned on the light, the room filled with a soft yellow glow, empty and quiet. On the table, the case files on Richard's death lay open. Natalie had retrieved them that afternoon from the archives at the old town hall. She had read every line. Cause of death, accidental drowning. But then she saw something odd in a small note below. Inconsistency between autopsy and witness statement. File incomplete. Next to it was another document, a payment receipt made out to a woman named M. St. Reynolds. Natalie had no idea who she was, but the address listed was Bell Street. She leaned back in her chair, fingers tightening around the photograph the stranger had sent. The man in the gray coat beside her father stared directly into the lens. A faint smile on his lips, but his eyes were shadowed. There was something familiar in that look, like a gaze that had once stood in her home, deep in the night, before she even knew what fear was. She folded the file. The paper crackled like dry leaves. In her mind, she heard her own voice at 8 years old. "Mom, why did they say that?" And her mother's, "Don't listen to them." Now, Natalie whispered back, a reply decades late, "Then I'll listen myself, until I know everything." She stood, pulled on her coat. Outside, rain poured down, each drop tapping against the window like a drumbeat for her resolve. The clock read 2:17 a.m. She unlocked her phone and sent a message to the number that had sent her the photo. "Meet me. Bell Street." Harriet sat alone in the room, a half-burned candle flickering before her. The golden light swayed against the walls, casting shadows across her face, carving old lines deeper like etchings in stone. Every time she closed her eyes, the funeral came back the sound of falling earth, the scent of jasmine, and Natalie's wide-eyed stare too young to hate, but already drifting away. She had never forgotten the night before that day. It had been raining. Richard hadn't come home. Outside, wind lashed against the windows, rain hammering the glass like frantic knocking. Harriet sat in the living room, clutching a slip of paper he had left behind. Bell Street. Don't wait up. It was the first time in 10 years of marriage he had left without explanation. And it would be the last. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. 3 knocks. Even, deliberate. Exactly like the sound Harriet had heard the night before. She opened the door. A man stood there in a gray raincoat, his hood low over his face. The streetlight behind him made his features blur like a shadow. "He's not coming back," the man said, voice hoarse. "What?" "Richard. He's gone." Harriet froze. It felt like her heart had been torn out of her chest. The man lowered his head and placed something in her hand, a silver ring engraved with the letter R. Then he leaned in, voice hissing between clenched teeth. "Don't ask, and don't tell anyone." Harriet backed away, trembling. The door shut before she could say another word. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air, the same cologne Richard always wore. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, the police knocked. They said Richard's body had been found near the Oldbury Bridge. Drowned. No witnesses. No signs of struggle. Only a soaked wallet and a torn piece of paper, the writing smeared beyond recognition. Harriet opened her eyes. The room came back into view. The candle was nearly spent. She exhaled and looked down at the table. The photo of young Richard still lay there, its corner torn at the shoulder. In the dark, another memory surfaced. The night before Richard died, they had argued. He had said he wanted to leave to end the lies. Harriet hadn't understood what he meant at the time, but she remembered his eyes strange, haunted, like a man being hunted. "You have to trust me," he had said. "Trust what?" "That someone will come looking for you, but you can't say a word." That was the last time she saw him. After the funeral, a man in a black suit came to the house. He said nothing, only handed Harriet a thick envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words. It wasn't an accident. Harriet had burned it that same night, but the ashes of those words remained in her mind, like dust she could never wipe clean. Now, as Natalie began to unearth everything, Harriet felt the old fear return. Not fear of the truth, but fear that her daughter might meet the man in the gray coat again if he was still alive. She opened the desk drawer and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. On the first page, in her handwriting, Bell Street, 27th November. Below that, a list of names she had never dared to read aloud. Harriet closed the notebook, her hand gripping tightly. The wind outside surged. The candle went out with a hiss, leaving behind the sharp scent of smoke. In the darkness, Harriet heard something faint footsteps, or just the wind. Then a man's voice, low and close, like breath brushing against her ear. "I told you. Don't tell anyone." She turned sharply. No one was there. Only the curtains swayed slightly, and a dried jasmine petal drifted to the floor. Harriet fell to her knees, picking up the petal, cupping it in her palm. The scent faded quickly, but in her chest, the fear came alive again. Alive, as if it had never left. Harriet's house sat still, as if holding its breath. When Natalie pushed the door open, the creak of the hinge sounded like an old person groaning. The air inside was thick with dampness, the scent of stale tea, and faintly, jasmine. That scent made her shiver. She didn't know why, but it always felt both familiar and unsettling. Her mother wasn't home. The door to Harriet's room was slightly ajar, the warm glow of a bedside lamp casting a skewed beam across the wooden floor. On the table, a cold teacup still sat, its water ring dried into a perfect circle. But Natalie noticed something odd. The bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet had fresh scratches, as if it had been locked in a rush. She sat down and tried to pull it open. It didn't budge. The lock was old, a rusted rotary kind, but solid. Natalie searched the upper drawers and found a small box full of keys, house keys, car keys, drawer keys. She tried them one by one. On the 5th try, the lock clicked. The drawer opened. Inside was a small, dark wooden box, no larger than her joined palms. On the lid, the initials RH were hand-engraved thin, deep strokes. Natalie reached out. Dust coated the surface, but when she opened it, there were only a few items inside. A silver ring engraved with the letter R, a folded letter bound with a red thread, and a torn photo, just half of it remained, showing only the collar of a man's shirt, and a faint glimpse of a gray coat. Natalie's heart jolted. Her hand trembled as she picked up the letter. The paper was yellowed, its edges brittle, but the handwriting was clear. It wasn't Harriet's. It was her father's. H. If you're reading this, it means things have gotten out of hand. I can't come back. Don't look for me. Don't tell our daughter. Live as if I never existed. Beneath the last line, another sentence had been added in a different pen bolder, more erratic, as if written in haste. She knows. Those 2 words made Natalie freeze. And she had seen them before on the back of the torn photo. What does she know? The question echoed in her head, thudding with every heartbeat. She picked up the ring and turned it under the light. Inside was an engraving. R to H, until silence. Until silence. To Natalie, it sounded like a vow or a threat, dressed as one. She placed the ring on the table and took a deep breath. The jasmine scent returned stronger this time, so vivid she turned around, thinking someone was standing behind her. No one, just her own shadow dancing on the wall, flickering in the lamp's glow. Natalie examined the torn photograph up close. On the back was faint, faded ink, hard to read, but she could make out 2 words. Bell Street. Her chest tightened. Bell Street again. A chill crawled from the base of her neck down her spine. She took out her phone and snapped photos of everything: the letter, the ring, the photo. Then she placed everything back as it was, closed the box, locked the drawer, and wiped her fingerprints from the lock. As she stood, she noticed a tiny detail on the inside edge of the wooden box's lid. Barely visible unless the light hit it just right, were etched words: "Forgive me." Natalie left the house just as night fell. The wind rustled through the bare trees, the dry leaves whispering as they brushed against each other. Streetlights spilled yellow pools on the road, spreading like liquid. In her hand, the photo of the man in the gray coat standing beside her father had become a haunting presence. She whispered, almost to herself, "If Dad's still alive." Mom knew, didn't she? And then, in that very moment, her phone lit up. A new message. No name. "You're getting close. Stop asking about Bell Street." That night, Harriet couldn't sleep. Above her, the light from the street filtered through the curtain, casting blurry golden streaks on the ceiling, flickering like breath. The wind slipped through the cracks in the window, rustling the papers on the desk with a faint whish like someone flipping through them. She sat up, reaching for the handkerchief embroidered with the letter N. It was gone. Harriet walked to her desk. The bottom drawer, the one she had kept locked for 10 years, was open just a crack. The lock was still latched but loose, as if someone had twisted it forcefully. She froze, her palms icy, opened it. The wooden box was empty. The ring, the letter, the torn photo, all gone. No, this can't be," Harriet whispered, her head spinning. Who could have done this? It couldn't have been a stranger. No one else had the key. Only Natalie. As Harriet descended the stairs, a faint noise came from the living room. The hallway light spilled over the tile floor, revealing the silhouette of her daughter sitting on the couch, her back turned. Natalie was staring intently at a photograph in her hands. "You're awake?" Her voice was cold. Harriet stopped at the last step, pausing before she asked, "Did you go into my room?" "My room or Dad's?" Natalie turned. Her eyes were sharp, like blades. In them, Harriet saw a reflection of herself warped through the lens of resentment. "You shouldn't have gone through my things," Harriet said, trying to stay composed. "Then maybe you should have explained them to me." "Explained what?" "The box. The letter from Dad. Why you kept it hidden for 30 years. Harriet didn't answer. She just stood there, half her face lit by the wall sconce, half in light, half in shadow. "That's not something you need to know." "Not need to know?" Natalie let out a harsh laugh. "I'm his daughter. He died, and you were the only one there. Now I find proof you kept secrets and you still want me to believe in you?" "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the wind outside. Harriet tried to speak, but her throat tightened. Old images rushed back the rain-soaked night. The man in the gray coat, the cold ring, the warning, "Don't tell anyone." The truth hadn't even found its way out before Natalie turned away. "I'm tired. Don't expect me to be here in the morning." She walked up the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. Harriet remained standing in the still silence of the living room. She began tidying the desk. Her hand brushed the cold teacup, its glaze cracked along the rim. As she bent down, a scent drifted through the room, rich, sweet, unmistakable. Jasmine. Harriet looked up. The window was shut. No one had grown jasmine in this house for years. She turned around. At the end of the hall stood a shadow. A man's figure, tall, thin, unmoving in the dim light. "Richard?" she whispered. No answer. Only the jasmine scent grew stronger, and the sound of wind hissing through the window frame. She stepped toward it, slowly. But when she reached the spot, the figure vanished. Only one thing remained: the handkerchief embroidered with N lying on the floor where he had stood. She picked it up. The fabric was still warm. On the inside corner, a blurred ink stain like someone had written something and then tried to wipe it away. Thursday, Bell Street. Harriet collapsed into the chair, her shoulders trembling. A part of her understood. The past had come knocking, and this time it wouldn't leave until everything was laid bare. Upstairs, Natalie still hadn't fallen asleep. She lay on her side, moonlight washing over the ceiling. In her hand, she held her father's letter, the old paper trembling in the breeze. At the bottom, the H had smudged from the sweat on her palm. Natalie whispered, a voice torn between anger and fear. If Mom really is innocent, why hide? Outside, the wind picked up. The window blew open. A single white flower drifted into her lap, soft, fragrant, and dead. The scent of jasmine had begun to cling to everything. The sheets, the clothes, Harriet's hair. No matter how many times she washed her hands, the fragrance lingered faint but stubborn, like a spirit that refused to let go. The next morning, Harriet sat by the window, a steaming cup of tea in hand, watching mist weave between the trees. The dim morning light made the house feel wrapped in a haze of memory. She gently touched the handkerchief from the night before. The word Thursday had nearly faded, but Bell Street remained ink-dark and cold. From the neighbor's house, a radio hummed the old tune, Moon River, Richard's favorite. Everything around her felt like it was pulling time backward. And suddenly, the memory rose. 1979. Harriet was 19, working as a clerk in a small bookstore on Bell Street. Back then, she'd often be shelving books while rain tapped softly on the tin roof. One rainy afternoon, the door swung open. A man stepped in, rain clinging to his coat, holding a small bottle of perfume. He smiled, his voice low. "Can you help me find something for someone who tends to forget her husband's birthday?" Harriet looked up. He had kind eyes, a bit tired, but his smile was kind. "I'm Richard Hale," he said, as if he knew she was about to ask. Then he placed the perfume bottle on the counter. Jasmine Rain, her favorite scent. She picked it up, uncapped it, the soft scent of jasmine, laced with a hint of wood. A fragrance hard to forget. Richard smiled and said, "You should try it, to understand why I buy it for someone else." They talked longer than she'd expected. The conversation drifted from scents to books, from books to music. Richard mentioned a close friend, Thomas, who worked in fragrance import-export and had brought the perfume from France. "He knows scent better than anyone I've ever met," Richard had said. "He told me jasmine is the smell of memories that refuse to sleep." Harriet smiled then, never imagining that scent would follow her for the rest of her life, in every sense of the word. The color of the memory darkened. Night spilled across the frame in her mind. Years after that first meeting, after they had married, the Jasmine Rain bottle still sat on their dresser. Richard would sometimes dab a bit on his wrist before work. Then he started coming home late, or not at all. One night, she found a small envelope in his coat. The sender was Thomas R. Inside was a note. "Bell Street isn't safe anymore. They're watching." At the time, Harriet didn't understand. She assumed it was a warning from a friend, something about work. But now, remembering it, each word rang with a cold, metallic echo. And the man in the gray coat, it could very well have been Thomas. Harriet set her tea down, fingers trembling slightly. Now Thomas wasn't just a name from the past, he was the one who had led Richard down a path with no return. And she finally understood why the jasmine scent refused to leave this house. It was the scent of beginnings and of guilt. She stood and walked to the old wooden shelf where the bottle of Jasmine Rain still sat, half full, dust covering the glass. She opened the cap. The scent rose sweet, heady, painfully familiar. But then Harriet noticed something odd. This wasn't the same bottle. The glass was newer, the label different, not the one she had kept all these years. A chill ran down her spine. She spun around in the mirror, reflected behind her. Something moved, like the edge of a gray coat slipping past the hallway. She turned fast. No one, just the door slightly ajar, and the jasmine scent growing stronger. Harriet whispered, barely audible, "Thomas, is that you?" Harriet remained standing in the kitchen, the jasmine rain bottle open on the table. The scent of jasmine filled the air thick, almost suffocating, until it felt like the very air had turned to syrup, clinging to her skin. The room seemed to shrink around her. She had to sit down, both hands covering her face. That scent pulled Harriet back to a long-ago afternoon the last day on Bell Street. The sky was gray, wind whistling through the lampposts. Harriet held a letter in her hand, the paper creased from being written and rewritten. The first line trembled. "Richard, if you can still hear this, please come home." She sat by the window in a small rented room, the light inside dim like cigarette smoke. Outside, a streetcar rumbled past, rain tapping on the tin roof. On the table was the jasmine rain bottle, the very first wedding gift he had given her. Whenever she missed him, she would open the cap and take a breath, as if the scent could keep him near for just a few seconds longer. But that day, the jasmine was too strong. It swirled in her head, dizzying. And when she turned around, he was there. Thomas, the same gray overcoat, hands in pockets, soaked from rain. His face was more sunken than before, but his eyes calm, almost eerily so, hadn't changed. "Harriet," he said. "Where's Richard?" she asked immediately. "He's gone." "What are you saying?" Thomas stepped inside, his voice low, like a breath. "He had no choice. There are people who wanted what he had. And he thought hiding you was the only way to keep you safe." Harriet froze, staring at that stone-cold face. "Who are you talking about?" "People I don't even dare to name." He reached into his coat and placed an envelope on the table. "This is the last thing he left." "Don't open it until Thursday." "Thursday?" Thomas looked straight at her, his voice like steel scraping rock. "And don't tell anyone. No one." Harriet never opened that envelope. Thursday never came. 2 days later, they told her Richard had drowned in Oldbury, and Thomas vanished from the city. She tried to find him, called his company, wrote letters, but everything was returned unopened. Only once, months later, a small package arrived, a silver ring engraved with the letter R. No note, no postmark. Harriet understood. That was the end. And she placed everything into a wooden box, burying the past in silence. Now, 30 years later, the scent of jasmine still lingered. It had seeped into every thread of fabric, into the wood grain, into her dreams. She held the old letter from the drawer. The ink faded. It had never been sent, but she read it again as if she were finally answering a man long gone. "You asked me to stay silent. I have for far too long. And that silence is destroying everything you tried to protect." She folded the letter. A tear fell, landing on the word Richard. The ink bloomed outward, like a drop of jasmine oil spilled in water. Harriet stood and stepped outside. Night wrapped the street in stillness, save for a pale glow on the corner wall. On the table behind her, the bottle of jasmine rain remained open, its scent drifting into the hallway, curling around the staircase like a ribbon of smoke. In the distance, a church bell tolled 3 chimes. Harriet paused, hearing footsteps behind her. She didn't turn. She only asked softly, just loud enough for the dark to hear, "Thomas, was it you who took him from me?" No reply, only the wind slipping through the cracks, blowing out the candle. And in the darkness, the scent of jasmine grew so strong she had to cover her mouth to keep from crying. Across the city, Natalie opened her email inbox. A new message had arrived, no sender name. Just a single line. The scent never fades. Bell Street, Thursday. She stared at it for a long time, reading the words aloud in a whisper, a chill spreading down her spine. Jasmine. Bell Street. Something or someone was pulling her back to where it all began. Harriet sat alone in the living room that night. On the table lay the old notebook. The candle burned nearly to the end. Its trembling light looked like it was breathing. Outside, the wind blew hard, rattling the window. And the scent of jasmine, it was back again. So dense, Harriet had to take a deep breath just to stay calm. In her head, a voice rose. Not Natalie's, not Thomas's. It was her own voice, younger, urgent, panicked. "Richard, stop! Where are you going at this hour?" The room around Harriet blurred, colors shifting. The present vanished. All that remained was a rainy night, the yellow haze of street lamps and the slap of shoes on wet cobblestones. A fragment of memory. She was running after him, her dress soaked, holding a broken umbrella. Richard walked quickly ahead, his coat flaring open, rain pounding on his shoulders. "Who are you running from?" Harriet shouted, her voice swallowed by the wind. Richard didn't turn back. He only called out through the rain, "If they ask, tell them I'm on a business trip. Don't go back to Bell Street." The jasmine was suffocating. She didn't know if it came from the rain, his collar, or the small bottle she carried in her pocket. Another memory. An engine roared. Headlights sliced through the night. Another figure appeared under the streetlight. Thomas, in his gray coat, standing beneath an umbrella. Richard stopped. The two men stared at each other. No words. Then Richard tossed Thomas an envelope and turned away. Harriet hid behind a tree, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would break. The wind caught a loose sheet from the envelope, blowing it toward her. She bent down and picked it up. Scrawled across it, ink smeared. "Thursday. Don't let her follow." A drop of water fell, blurring the words completely. Another fragment the next morning. Cold light through a hospital window. The police saying, "We found his body downstream at Oldbury." Harriet sat on a chair, clutching her handkerchief, feeling the blood drain from her veins. One officer asked, "Do you know a Thomas Reynolds?" Harriet looked up, her voice trembling. "He's my husband's friend. He left the city last night. No forwarding address." "And my husband?" "No one knows what happened." The memory shattered, images overlapping. Headlights, a hand pulling her back, water breaking, a voice in the rain. "He didn't fall into the river. He disappeared." Then silence. Everything went silent. Only the tick of the clock remained, and the jasmine smell, thick as smoke. Harriet opened her eyes. She was still in the present, but her hands gripped the edge of the table, nails digging into the wood. Sweat beaded on her forehead. The candle had gone out. The room was dark, lit only by flickers from the window. She stood, trembling, and walked to the mirror. In the reflection, her face was pale, aged, her eyes sunken. But behind her shoulder, something flickered, a gray coat passing. Harriet spun around. Nothing, only the handkerchief with the letter N falling from her pocket to the floor. And beneath it, a small folded note Harriet was sure she'd never seen before. She opened it. The ink was shaky. "I told you not to follow." Harriet collapsed to her knees, her breath breaking. She knew now memory was no longer memory. It was finding its way back on its own. Outside the window, the wind slammed hard. Somewhere, a door creaked open, like a voice calling. Harriet closed her eyes, and in her mind, a date rang clear, a date she had never dared to remember for 30 years, 27th November, 1992. The night he died. November 27th, 1992. Harriet stood in the rain, beneath the bent canopy of an old umbrella. Water poured down her face, cold to the bone. In the distance, the Oldbury Bridge was just a trembling black blur in the mist. Richard was there. She knew it. Wind howled through the trees, blowing the handkerchief from her coat pocket, the one embroidered with an N, a gift from Natalie on her father's birthday. It dropped into a puddle, drifting away, spinning in the rushing rain. Harriet wanted to reach for it, but her legs felt frozen in place. Then she saw him tall, in a dark coat, standing at the edge of the bridge. Another figure stood beside him. Thomas, in gray, holding a black umbrella. The streetlights flickered, casting faint, blade-like streaks of light on the wet pavement. "Richard!" Harriet called, her voice lost in the wind. He turned, that look full of regret and fear. "Harriet, go! You shouldn't be here!" "What's going on?" "There's no time." "You have to go home to our daughter." "No, you need to tell me the truth." Thomas stepped forward, his voice gravelly and low. "He can't come back, Harriet. They'll find him. And if you're here, they'll find you too." "Who are you to say that?" Harriet shouted. Thomas didn't answer. He simply placed a hand on Richard's shoulder, a silent farewell. Richard looked at Harriet one last time. His mouth moved, but the wind swallowed the words. Only two reached her ears. "I'm sorry." Then a sharp cracking sound. Metal or a slip, it was unclear. Harriet rushed forward, just in time to see Richard lose his balance, tumbling over the railing. Water exploded upward in a white spray. Thomas stood motionless, expressionless, not shocked, but cold, as if he had known all along. Harriet screamed, "Help him! Do something!" Thomas turned away. His silhouette disappeared into the rain, fading into the darkness. On the bridge railing, only the bottle of jasmine rain remained shattered, its fragrance spilling across the air. Harriet jolted awake in the middle of the night, gasping. Cold sweat soaked her back. The room was dark, rain tapping hard against the window. She looked around and saw the handkerchief lying beside the bed, dry, spotless. Her hands shaking, Harriet picked it up, and something small slipped out from inside. A worn metal tag engraved with St. Mary's Clinic, Patient ID, R. Hale. She froze. The tag was untouched, not rusted, as if someone had just placed it there. St. Mary's, a private clinic on the outskirts of town, closed since 1995. If this tag was real, Richard had been taken to a hospital after that night. Harriet stumbled back into the chair, clutching her chest. Her breath came fast and shallow. Everything in her mind spun memories: wind, Jasmine, Thomas's face, the splash of water. She whispered, "No, it can't be. He's dead." "They said they found his body." But another voice echoed in her mind. "No one saw it, Harriet. No one ever saw his body." Harriet looked at the tag again. Light from the window reflected off the metal. At the corner, a small scratch shaped like a crescent moon, exactly like the mark on the ring, R to H, until silence. Two objects, same symbol. It couldn't be a coincidence. The room fell completely silent. Then, a soft sound behind her. 3 knocks, slow, steady, just like the knocks the night Richard disappeared. Harriet spun around. No one. Only the window blown open, rain splashing onto the floor. A white flower lay in the puddle. On its petal, a tiny bead of black ink still wet. Harriet picked it up, touched it lightly. The ink spread, leaving a single word: Thursday. She let the flower fall, and in that moment, Harriet understood. The past had never died. It was only waiting for the right day to return, and that day was this coming Thursday. Across the city, Natalie sat in her car, the streetlights casting golden patterns on her face. She opened her phone, staring again at the anonymous message. The scent never fades. Bell Street, Thursday. Natalie whispered, as if to herself, Thursday. That's tomorrow. Wednesday morning. The sky was gray, mist draping the narrow street like a shroud. Natalie sat in her car, parked a few houses down from her mother's. She hadn't gone in yet. On her lap rested a cold cup of coffee and a photo her father holding her hand when she was little. His smile was gentle, but now, looking at it again, there was something off about it, or maybe she was only now seeing the cracks in her own memory. She hadn't slept the night before. The message still glowed on her screen. Bell Street, Thursday. And in her mind, 3 words kept looping. The scent never fades. Jasmine. That scent had wrapped itself around every secret in that house. Natalie stepped out of the car. The wind sliced across her cheek like a blade. When she pushed open the door, a small bell chimed a familiar sound from childhood, the one that used to make her run out to greet her mother. Now, it only chilled her. The house was darker than usual, windows barely cracked, curtains still drawn. Natalie walked slowly, her shoes thudding softly against the wooden floor. From the kitchen came Harriet's voice, low, trembling, as if she were on the phone. Natalie froze, heart pounding. Her mother's voice grew clearer as she approached the hallway. "No, I can't tell her." A pause. "You promised to stay silent forever. Why are you calling me now?" Silence. "Haven't I suffered enough? Do you want me to tell her that her father is still alive?" Natalie's chest tightened. She stood frozen behind the wall. Those words pierced like needles. Her father is still alive. She heard Harriet's breathing, shaky. Her voice was trembling. "I kept the promise. 30 years. I told no one. But if you call again, I'll have no choice. I'm not afraid anymore." A small click. The call ended. Then silence. Natalie leaned against the wall, her heart beating so loudly it hurt her ears. She almost stepped forward, but then Harriet spoke again, this time to herself, soft, weary, but every word clear. "If you're still alive, Richard, why didn't you come back? Why let me carry the guilt for you?" Natalie nearly burst into the room, ready to scream, to demand answers. But she stopped herself. Not yet. Not while her mother was still hiding. She slipped out the back door, silent as a thief, heart still pounding. As she walked into the garden, she heard something metallic drop. She bent down and saw a small object beneath the tree, a St. Mary's Clinic tag, just like the one Harriet had found the night before, but this one was different. On the back, faintly etched, "Patient No. 19, R. Hale. Status, confidential." Natalie picked it up. Rain pooled on the metal, reflecting the dull gray sky. She inhaled deeply. The scent of wet earth and jasmine, thick in the air, made her dizzy. Then it struck her. Harriet never planted jasmine. But here, by the base of the tree, the scent was overwhelming. Beneath the wet soil, something was buried. She dropped to her knees, digging with her hands. Just beneath the surface, her fingers touched fabric soft, old, wrapped around a small object. She unwrapped it. A silver ring, engraved with the letter R, identical to the one she'd seen in her mother's wooden box. But inside this one, a new line had been scratched in, crude and uneven. "Find me. Thursday." Natalie clenched her fist around it, rain dripping from her hair. She whispered, voice breaking, "If you're alive, Mom knew. She's known all along." She turned and walked quickly toward the gate. The first streetlights flicked on, their glow shimmering in the puddles. The sound of a car echoed faintly in the distance. Natalie pulled out her phone and opened the anonymous message again. Her fingers trembled as she typed, slow and deliberate. "Who are you?" Less than a minute later, the screen lit up. A reply appeared short, direct. "Someone who was supposed to die." Rain fell steadily, the streetlights stretching across the wet asphalt into blurred streaks of light. Natalie sat in her car, her phone screen glowing faintly. The latest message still lingered 4 cold words. Someone who was supposed to die. With trembling hands, she typed, "Where are you?" Seconds later, a location appeared. An old address, tucked away in the outskirts, St. Mary's Clinic. She glanced at the time, 8:47 p.m. The rain hadn't stopped, but she didn't hesitate. The engine roared to life, its growl folding into the rhythm of the rain. When she arrived, the road surrounding the clinic was shrouded in darkness. The sign that read St. Mary's Clinic was rusted, the light above it flickering as if it were about to die. Moss covered the walls, the main entrance locked, but a side door stood ajar. Natalie stepped inside, her phone's flashlight cutting through the decay, peeling paint, crooked doctor nameplates, warped linoleum floors. The air reeked of disinfectant and mildew. But deeper inside Jasmine, subtle but distinct. It stopped her in her tracks, that scent, the same one that haunted her mother's home. Then a man's voice, rough and low, echoed from the far end of the corridor. "You came." Natalie spun around. A man stood in the shadows, lean, in a long raincoat. The dim light caught part of his face, sharp cheekbones, sunken eyes, tired but sharp. He stepped forward, holding a small metal tag identical to the one Natalie had. "Who are you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Who I am doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is, I was once listed as a patient here." "St. Mary's?" "Yes." "And I was declared dead." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "Just like your father." Natalie stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. "You knew my father?" "I did. He was the only one who ever escaped." The air thickened. Outside, the rain tapping on the windows sounded like needles on skin. "Escaped from what?" she asked. "From those who forged the records here, who faked deaths." Natalie couldn't speak. The man stepped closer, voice dropping to a whisper. "They did this for people who needed to disappear. It was part of a plan. Richard Hale didn't die. He was hidden." "Hidden? By who?" His eyes darkened. "By the man he trusted most. Thomas Reynolds." The name landed like a blade through memory. Natalie stood frozen, the image of the man in the gray coat surfacing in her mind, blending with the jasmine drifting through the hallway. "Your father was deceived," the man went on. "Thomas said he'd help him escape the debt, the threats. But instead, he made the world believe he was dead. He was transferred here to St. Mary's for treatment, then erased." Natalie shook her head, her voice cracking. "No. If my father was alive, why didn't he come back?" The man looked at her, eyes distant and lost in shadow. "Because something, or someone, kept him away. And the only person who knows where he is now is your mother." Natalie couldn't breathe. The hallway felt like it had no air. She looked around, her flashlight landing on a stain on the wall. It looked like letters bleeding through the peeling paint. She stepped closer, scrawled in black ink across the damp wall. "She knows. Bell Street, Thursday." The ink was still wet. She turned back, but the man was gone. Only the window remained open, wind rushing through, the scent of jasmine so thick she covered her nose. On the floor where he had stood lay something small, a broken metal tag. Natalie picked it up. One letter remained etched on its surface. R. She backed out of the building, dazed and shaking. By the time she reached the car, her phone buzzed. A new message again, from the anonymous number. "If you want the truth, ask your mother about Bell Street, tomorrow night." Natalie sat in the car, watching the rain streak across the windshield. For the first time, she felt afraid of her mother. not out of anger, but because she was beginning to believe that for 30 years Harriet had lived beside a dead man, or with the secret of a death that had never happened. Thursday evening. For the first time in days, the lights in Harriet's house were on. On the dining table, 2 bowls of soup sat cooling in the cold air. The golden glow from the ceiling light dimmed the whole space like a veil over the room. Harriet sat at the head of the table, hands clasped tightly. Natalie sat across from her, arms folded, eyes steady with forced calm. Between them, silence. Thick, heavy, almost tangible. "If you have something to say, just say it," Harriet spoke, her voice weary. Natalie looked at her mother for a long moment. "I only have one question." "Yes? Is Dad still alive?" Harriet froze. Her lips trembled, eyes blinked rapidly, as if that one question had tilted the entire room. "I told you before. Your father died 30 years ago." "Then why were you speaking to someone and calling him love? Why is there a patient tag from St. Mary's Clinic in your house?" Harriet fell silent. The clock ticked. A droplet of water fell from the faucet plink. A simple sound, but in the dead quiet kitchen, it struck like a hammer. "You were eavesdropping?" Harriet asked softly. "If you hadn't lied, I wouldn't have had to," Natalie replied. Harriet lowered her head. A faint whiff of jasmine rose from her hair. Natalie inhaled. She hated that scent, but for some reason, tonight it pressed into her chest like grief. "You don't know what you're looking for," Harriet said. "I'm looking for the truth," Natalie answered. "Not all truths save people." Natalie tilted her head slightly, a bitter smile forming. "But look around. Has hiding anything ever saved anyone?" Silence again. Harriet stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. Outside, the streetlights reflected off the rain like strands of silver falling from the sky. "I was there the night he fell from the bridge," she said. "I know." "I called to him, but he didn't answer. I thought he died." Natalie stared at her mother's back. "And you were wrong." Harriet turned around, her eyes a mix of panic and despair. "Who told you that?" "Someone who was supposed to be dead." Harriet went still. Her face turned pale. "You went there? St. Mary's?" "Yes." "You shouldn't have." "Why not?" "Because no one who was ever there truly leaves." The words made Natalie shiver. She could see her mother's hands trembling on the windowsill, frail fingers, veins raised. Then Harriet spoke again, soft but clear. "If he's still alive, you must not look for him." "Why not?" "Because he chose to disappear, and if you find him, you won't believe in the things you want to believe anymore." Natalie let out a dry laugh. "Now I get it. You're not afraid because he died. You're afraid because he's alive." The air between them froze. They stared at each other, close enough to hear each other's breath. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. The rain grew heavier. Harriet opened her mouth to say something, but a sharp clack echoed from the kitchen. A metallic sound. Both turned. Neither moved. "Is anyone else in the house?" Natalie whispered. "No." Another clack, louder this time, stretched into a slow creak, like an old hinge giving way. Harriet moved slowly toward the kitchen. Natalie stood and followed. They stopped at the threshold. The kitchen was dim, only the hallway light filtering through. On the tiled floor, the bottle of jasmine rain perfume rolled slowly, tapping against the cabinet before coming to a stop. Its cap had popped off. Liquid pooled on the floor. The scent hit them thick, suffocating. Harriet stumbled back a step. Natalie watched her mother's lips form 2 silent words. "Thomas?" Both women stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. The perfume bottle lay on the floor, its contents spreading like a gleaming streak of blood in the dim light. The scent of jasmine filled the room, sweet, sharp, so thick it made them nauseous. Harriet gripped the back of a chair, eyes locked on the shadowy corner behind the fridge. Natalie took one careful step forward. The hallway light cast a pale glow on half her face, ghostly white. "Someone's here," she whispered. A gust of wind slipped through the crack in the door. Then shafef, a sound like fabric brushing against the wall. They both turned. A figure flickered in the darkness at the far end of the kitchen, tall, thin, wearing a long coat. Lightning flashed outside the window, illuminating the edge of a gray coat. Harriet stumbled back, hand over her mouth. "No, it can't be." Natalie didn't have time to speak. The back door burst open. Wind rushed in, and the scent of jasmine surged through the room. She ran out, but the hallway was empty. No one. Only the door swinging open, creaking on its hinges like a sigh. Harriet collapsed into a chair. She trembled, hands clenched tightly in her lap, eyes unfocused. Natalie shut the door, bolted it, and turned back. "Mom? Who was that?" "I don't know." "You do." Harriet lifted her gaze, her eyes clouded, lost in fear. "If that was Thomas, it means it's all about to end." Natalie froze. "What do you mean?" Harriet didn't answer. She stared at the floor. Amid the puddle of spilled perfume, a small, folded piece of paper lay soaked along one edge. Natalie bent down and picked it up, scrawled in messy ink. It wasn't an accident. The ink had bled but was still readable. Natalie looked up, hands shaking. "Dad? He didn't die by accident, did he?" Harriet gripped her hands tighter, her knuckles white. "You wouldn't understand." "I'm trying to, but you're making it worse." Natalie tossed the note on the table. "Tell me, how long have you known?" Harriet didn't reply. She just stared at the paper, her eyes dazed. A flash of lightning lit up the window, casting Harriet's shadow onto the wall, trembling, hunched, like someone weighed down by guilt. Then Harriet spoke, voice broken. "That night, he didn't fall. Someone pushed him." Natalie froze. "Who?" "Maybe Thomas. Maybe someone else. But he never fell alone." Natalie stared at her mother, heart pounding. "If you knew this, why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because if I did, you'd lose him completely, not just in name, but in memory. And I would lose you." Natalie stood still. Tears fell, though she didn't notice. The scent of jasmine grew stronger, thick, cloying. She struggled to breathe, took a step back. Another flash of lightning lit the room, casting reflections in the fridge door and in it, the silhouette of a man standing between them. Natalie turned quickly, a gasp escaping her. "Mom, someone's here!" Harriet spun toward where her daughter pointed. No one. The shadow vanished with the lightning. Only the jasmine lingered heavy and unshakable. Harriet trembled, whispering into the air, "If you're still alive, please don't come back." Natalie heard her mother's voice crack like glass, and in that moment, she understood. Her mother wasn't just afraid of Thomas. She was afraid of the very man Natalie had spent her whole life searching for. Thunder roared outside. Rain lashed against the windows. On the table, the paper soaked through the ink from the words, "It wasn't an accident," blurred into a dark ring until the sentence dissolved completely, as if the past had just erased itself. The next morning, the sky looked as if it had been dusted with ash. The air was thick with the smell of rain, damp earth rising from the yard. Natalie woke up on the couch, her neck stiff, hands frozen. On the table before her sat a pile of evidence fragments of memory, made of paper, metal, and jasmine scent. She laid them out, carefully for the first time, trying to see the full picture. An unsent letter from Harriet. The silver ring engraved with R to H until silence. 2 metal tags from St. Mary's Clinic, one labeled Patient ID R. Hale, the other engraved with Status Confidential. A torn photo showing only the collar of a gray coat. And the water-stained paper, its words now blurred. It wasn't an accident. Each item held its own scent, but when placed together, they blended into something uncanny. Jasmine mixed with rust, a smell both familiar and wrong. Natalie opened her laptop. On the screen, she scrolled through the digital patient records she'd found the night before, St. Mary's Clinic admissions from 1991 to 1995. The final entry for 1992 had been crossed out, the name obscured, replaced with initials, RH19. Under status, transferred, 28/11/1992. The day after Richard's reported death, she clicked to expand the notes. A small, shaky sentence appeared. No body found. Case closed by external order. External order? Who had the authority to close a case like that? Only someone in power or someone with something to hide? Thomas. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and tried to connect the dots. Richard met Thomas. Richard disappeared. Then Thomas disappeared. Saint. Mary's logged a transfer. 30 years later, her mother still received late-night calls from a man, and in the house the Jasmine never left. Something chilled her. If Richard was still alive, he had to be nearby, close enough to send a message, to swap a perfume bottle, close enough to come back. Natalie opened her mother's old journal. The leather cover was worn, the edges torn. On the first page, Harriet's handwriting, neat, soft. She flipped to the end, to the entries after the funeral in 1992, and then a sudden void. From mid-December 1992 to February 1993, the pages were blank, paper still intact but unwritten. The next page bore handwriting that was different, sharper, slanted unmistakably like Richard's. Natalie touched the page, her heart pounding. The first line read, "It wasn't your fault, H. They wanted silence. H. Harriet." No doubt. Someone had written a message in her mother's journal. She turned another page. The handwriting was shakier now, as if the writer was weak or in a hurry. Bell Street, File 19. Don't let her find me. Her. Natalie read the word again and again. Who? Her mother? Or someone else? A shiver ran down her spine. She flipped through the remaining pages. At the very end, a final line in faint ink nearly erased, but still visible. If she remembers, everything ends. She froze. She. Who was that? If Richard had written it, she could be Harriet. If it was Thomas, she might be Natalie. Natalie stood and walked to the window. Outside, a cold silver light coated the empty street. The wind carried the scent of jasmine, faint, rootless. She turned back to the table, eyes on the journal, her chest tightening with a single, unshakable thought. Someone's been writing in it. After Mom goes to sleep. She jolted, looking around. Silence. Only the desk lamp flickered, casting the journal's shadow on the wall. And the shadow it moved, gently, like pages being turned. She stepped closer and opened the book again. On the last page, a fresh line had appeared, the ink still wet, acrid in the air. Bell Street. Midnight. Come alone. Natalie stumbled back, knuckles white around the journal. She looked out the window, light rain drifting down, the jasmine scent hanging heavy in the air, and somewhere in the distance, 3 knocks echoed faintly. Knock, knock, knock. Bell Street. 11:57 p.m. The street lay buried in fog, yellow streetlights bleeding across the wet pavement like dried blood. The old windows of the abandoned building reflected the headlights of Natalie's car. She turned off the engine and sat still, hands resting on the wheel. No one should be here. No one was supposed to be here. But the scent of jasmine hung in the air, thick, unmistakable. It led her forward. She grabbed her flashlight and stepped out. Cold wind slapped her face, fine rain falling like ash. St. Mary's Clinic, Bell Street branch, stood at the end of the alley, a crumbling red brick building, its sign crooked and chipped beyond recognition. A paper seal still clung to the door, though the bottom corner had been torn. She bent down and slipped through the gap. Inside, the darkness was thick. Her flashlight skimmed across dusty waiting chairs, empty medicine cabinets, moss-lined corridors. The air reeked of mold, laced with jasmine strong and sickly sweet, like a sleeping drug. A faint click echoed. She couldn't tell where from. Natalie froze, listening. Only the steady drip from ceiling to floor, slow, rhythmic, soft. She moved forward. At the end of the corridor stood a steel door with a faded sign. Records. Archive room. The rusty lock was broken, the door slightly ajar. Natalie pushed gently, the hinge groaned like a dying breath. Inside, rows of file boxes stacked to the ceiling. Her flashlight passed over yellowed labels, P12, P13, P14. Her heart pounded when she saw it. P19. She pulled it down, a cloud of dust rising into her face. Inside, a thick folder. Hard cover. Printed words. Patient 19. R. Hale. Date of admission, 27. Nov, 1992. Transferred, 28. Nov, 1992. The first page showed a patient photo, a man's face, blurred by water damage, but still recognizable. Richard Hale. Her hand trembled as she touched it, then turned the second page. Condition: neurological trauma, partial amnesia. Notes: subject remembers scent stimuli. Jasmine. Status: relocated for protection. She read the last line again, each word a knife to the heart. Relocated for protection. Protected from whom? She flipped to the final page. An empty box titled Emergency Contact, Guardian, Name, typed clearly below it, Harriet Hale. Natalie stopped breathing. No, it couldn't be. Her mother, not Thomas, not the authorities, was the listed guardian of patient 19. A droplet from the ceiling splashed onto the folder, blurring the name Hale into a gray smear. Natalie stepped back, dizzy. She saw it now, her mother at the dinner table, eyes avoiding hers, voice trembling, the words, "He didn't fall alone." If her mother had been the guardian, she'd known he was alive, all these years, all of Natalie's childhood. She clutched the folder, trying to hold back tears. "Why, Mother?" she whispered. The words echoed in the room, cold as if someone else had whispered them with her. From the corner, something shifted. Natalie spun, flashlight darting. No one, just a gray coat swinging on the wall hook. A doctor's coat, torn collar. The faint scent of jasmine drifting from it, old, familiar. The same scent her father always wore. She stepped closer. Something was in the pocket. A small folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. She lied to protect me. Don't hate her. The ink was smudged, the paper damp, but the handwriting was sharp. No signature, but she recognized it slanted, rigid, trembling. Richard's. Natalie held the note tightly, somewhere between sobbing and screaming. If he was alive, where was he now? And why had he let her mother carry this guilt alone? Her flashlight flickered, dimmed, then died. In the darkness, Natalie heard it, a soft breath. Near, right behind her. She spun, flicked the flashlight back on. No one, just the back door, cracked open, cold wind blowing in. On the floor, wet footprints a man's trailed out into the night. Natalie chased after them, but by the time she reached the hallway, only mist remained. Jasmine hung in the air, dissolving into the fog. Far in the distance, the church bell tolled 3 times. Midnight. She stood frozen in the dark corridor, heart racing, still clutching the note. In her mind, only one sentence echoed as if spoken from deep within her past. She lied to protect me. The next morning, the first light of day spilled across the peeling walls of Harriet's room. The house was unusually quiet. Natalie stood at the doorway, holding the file labeled Patient 19. Her mother sat by the window, shoulders slightly hunched, a cold cup of tea untouched before her. She didn't look at her daughter, only stared outside where the white jasmine by the fence was shedding its flowers. "You knew," Natalie said, voice hoarse. Harriet didn't turn. "You weren't supposed to go there." "I already did. I figured." Natalie set the file on the table. The cover flipped open, revealing Richard Hale's name and the line "relocated for protection." "He's alive," she said. Harriet said nothing. "You signed as his guardian." This time Harriet turned. Her eyes were red and tired. "Yes." "Why?" "Because he was my husband, and no one else could." "No." "You did it because you were afraid of him." The words shattered the silence like broken glass. Harriet studied her daughter for a long moment, then whispered, "Afraid, but not for the reason you think." The room was washed in pale light. An old clock ticked steadily, like a countdown. Natalie stood still, her heart racing. "What were you afraid of, Mom?" Harriet drew a slow breath. "I was afraid of the day you'd find out who your father really was." A memory surged. The present dissolved, replaced by faded, trembling frames laced with jasmine. 1992. Harriet stood in the living room. Richard sat at the table, stacks of documents before him, debt forms, transfer papers, Thomas Reynolds' contracts. "What are you doing?" Harriet asked. "Protecting us." "By faking your own medical records? By disappearing?" She grabbed his hand. "Thomas is using you, Richard. Can't you see it?" He pulled away sharply. "Thomas is helping me escape the mess you created." She froze. "Me?" "What are you talking about?" "You went to the police, didn't you? You made them aware of Bell Street." "I didn't do anything." "Don't lie!" He jumped up, slamming his hand on the table, knocking over the bottle of jasmine rain perfume. Liquid spilled across the floor. The scent engulfed the room. Harriet stepped back, her voice shrinking. "You're scared." "No. I just need silence." Then Richard picked up the phone, dialing quickly. She heard him whisper, "Urgent. Thursday, Bell Street. Move everything. Don't let her follow." The memory dissolved, returning Harriet to the present. Her hands clenched. "I tried to stop him, but it was too late. When I got to Oldbury Bridge, he was already with Thomas." Natalie cut in. "Thomas pushed him." "No," Harriet shook her head. "He jumped." Natalie froze. "He jumped on his own, Natalie. But Thomas didn't help, and he didn't die." "Because you saved him?" Harriet was silent. "No." Thomas had already arranged his escape. "Why?" "Because he needed Richard alive and silent." Natalie sat, her head spinning. "So everything you did, all of it, was to hide that my father was a criminal?" Harriet looked down at her hands. A thin, faded scar ran along her wrist like a mark from an old rope. "I hid it because, yes, he made mistakes. But not for money. It was for someone." "Someone." "Thomas." The air tightened. "I used to think Thomas was his friend, but he was the reason it all began. The Bell Street project, the hospital, the staged death, it was all him." "What did he make you do?" Harriet closed her eyes. "A trade. One man with no memory, for another who knew too much. Natalie couldn't understand. She wanted to ask more, but Harriet opened her eyes, voice low, steady. Your father didn't just fake his death, Natalie. He left something behind, at St. Mary's. And Thomas kept it as leverage. Outside the window, wind swept through the jasmine, scattering petals. Natalie saw it, the fear in her mother's eyes, no longer hidden. Harriet whispered, like a plea. Don't look for him anymore, Natalie. You'll regret it. Natalie stood, voice dry. No, Mom, I can't stop, because now I don't believe anyone anymore. Harriet closed her eyes, tears falling silently. Outside, the church bells rang 4 chimes. Thursday, the day every broken memory began to fit back into place. The next afternoon, Natalie returned to St. Mary's, the file for patient 19 tucked under her arm. The rain from the night before had just passed, and a cold white light reflected off the damp tiles. No one knew she was here. No one would be coming with her. The back door stood ajar, just like before. The hinge groaned its familiar note, releasing a rush of damp air and old jasmine. She stepped inside, flashlight trembling in her hand. This time she wasn't looking for patient 19. She was looking for file 20. She searched the shelves, dust falling like mist. File box P20 was shoved against the wall, hidden beneath a pile of rotted folders. When she pulled it free, the lid came loose, and papers scattered across the floor. On the cover, a faded label read, Patient 20, Confidential, Linked Case, P19. Natalie opened it. No photo, no name. Just a single typed page. Subject, female, age 3. Identifying features, birthmark, left wrist. Relation to P19, dependent. Note, exchange approved, Project Bell Street. Authorized by H. Hale. Her heart skipped a beat. Age 3. Birthmark on the left wrist. She looked down at her hand, the faint teardrop-shaped mark that had been there since she was born. It couldn't be. She flipped to the next section. Patient transferred under alias NH for safety and continuity. NH, Natalie Hale. She stumbled back, hands shaking. The page slipped from her fingers, landing in a puddle on the floor. The word alias blurred into waves. The jasmine scent thickened, almost unbearable. No, I'm their daughter. I have to be, she whispered. But in her head, Harriet's voice echoed from some distant place. He exchanged a man who lost his memory for one who'd never speak. And now she understood. The one who lost his memory, Richard. The one who stayed silent, the child called Natalie. A vague memory surfaced, dreamlike and soft. A white room, the smell of antiseptic. A woman clutching a little girl, her voice trembling. I won't let them take you. She couldn't see the face, only the woman's wrist, a long, faded scar, just like Harriet's. A man's voice behind them, cold and urgent. We have to do this. If we don't, they'll kill us both. The girl cried. The woman pleaded. Richard, don't. She's not for this. They need her memory, Harriet. Without it, I'll die. We'll lose everything. The memory snapped. Natalie gasped, collapsing to the floor, hand over her mouth. Her heart pounded, tears falling uncontrollably. In the distance, the hallway clock chimed 3 times those familiar chimes, as if summoning the past. She picked up the soaked paper, pressed it between her trembling palms. The paper had frayed, and a crease had opened on the back, revealing a hidden line. Exchange confirmed. Child N integrated successfully. Procedure complete. 28/11/1992. That date. The day Richard died. The day she was born. She looked up. A figure stood at the end of the hallway. Tall, thin, wearing a dark coat, silver hair catching the flickering light. It didn't move. Natalie gripped the paper tightly, stepped forward. Dad? She called, voice barely audible. No reply, just the wind passing through, jasmine thick in the air. She stepped closer, flashlight trembling. The figure faded, dissolving into the air. But before it vanished completely, a raspy male voice whispered, "Don't hate her, Nat. She traded herself for you." She froze. The flashlight dropped, its beam sweeping across the floor until it stopped on hurried white chalk on the wall. Bell Street wasn't a place. It was an experiment. Natalie collapsed to her knees, fingers brushing the words, her chest heavy with something lost and something found. Her father hadn't died. Her mother hadn't fully lied. But Natalie Hale, the name, the life, the memories, might never have been truly hers. Outside, the rain began to fall. The wind blew dry jasmine petals through the broken window, brushing her hair. The scent was no longer sweet. It was sharp, bitter, and it tasted like tears. Night had fully fallen when Natalie returned. The house was still lit, as if Harriet had known she would come back. The scent of jasmine hung heavy in the air, sweet enough to sting the eyes. On the table, a candle burned low, its flickering flame trembling like the breath of someone fading. Harriet sat there in silence, her hands resting on an open journal. She didn't look up, didn't ask. She simply said, softly, "You found it." Natalie stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, the file clutched in her hands. Her voice was rough. "You signed it. November 28th. You knew everything. You knew I wasn't." Her throat caught. She couldn't finish. Harriet finally looked up, eyes glassy, but no longer afraid, only tired. "I knew, and I still chose to keep you." Natalie let out a hollow laugh, sharp as wind through broken glass. "You kept someone who was never yours? You are mine, Natalie, not by blood, but by choice." "And you traded me for him?" "No, I traded myself." The room went still. The ticking clock sliced through the silence like a blade. Harriet placed her hand on the journal, voice low. "They wanted a child with a clean mind to save him. I brought you in, but then they chose to keep you. Because you responded. Because you remembered." Natalie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Then who was your real child?" Harriet gave a sad smile. "You. No, I'm just a result." "No, Natalie. You're what's left of him and of me." Suddenly, thunder cracked in the distance. The window burst open. Wind rushed in. The candle went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Amid the pounding rain, there was another sound. Footsteps, slow, heavy, familiar. Harriet stood, whispering, "No, it can't be." Natalie turned toward the hallway. A figure appeared in the flash of lightning, tall, thin, wearing a dark raincoat, face hollow, but eyes achingly familiar. Harriet backed away, hand over her mouth. Natalie whispered, "Dad?" Richard stepped toward them. His voice was raspy, like it came from another lifetime. "Don't call me that." Rain lashed the windows like whispers in the dark. Harriet trembled. You shouldn't have come back." "I didn't come back to live, Harriet. I came back to end it." Natalie stepped forward. "You did all this? You made her lie for 30 years? Richard looked at her, weariness settling in his eyes. No one made her lie. She chose to. Harriet screamed, "Because you made me choose! You said if I didn't sign, they'd kill her." Richard was silent. Then slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a silver ring engraved with R to H until silence. Lightning flashed, catching the dull shine of the metal. "You remember, Harriet, I said silent until the end, but you couldn't stay silent." "Silent?" Natalie laughed, bitter and broken. That's what you call 30 years of lies? Richard looked at her. There was no regret, no warmth, only the exhaustion of a man who had carried too much for too long. You don't understand, Natalie. You were never the end. You were the beginning. Thunder roared. Harriet stepped back, tears mixing with rain. And now you lie to her again? No, Harriet, he said quietly. Now I tell the truth. From his coat, he pulled out an old photo, rain-stained, torn, the other half of the one Natalie had once found. He handed it to her. In it was not only Richard, but a little girl, one who looked just like Natalie, except for her eyes. That girl, Natalie stammered. She was our real daughter, Richard said, voice cracking. And she died at Bell Street. Silence. Only the clock ticking, the rain falling, Harriet's breath, shallow and broken. The entire room hovered in the space between memory and reality, a place where time had finally stopped. In the rain-drenched room, Harriet collapsed into the chair. Lightning flashed across her face, reflecting in eyes that looked like shattered glass. "What are you saying?" Her voice trembled, choking. Richard didn't answer right away. He looked at Natalie for a long time, as if staring into the past itself. The real girl died during the experiment at Bell Street. They wanted to replicate memory, to preserve the child's soul. But that memory, it refused to die. It found a new body. "You," Harriet choked, "you let them take her from me and turn her into this?" "I tried to save her, Harriet. If I hadn't agreed, they would have killed you both." "Save?" She laughed, hoarse and bitter. "You call turning our daughter's memory into a replica saving?" Natalie stepped back, heart racing. Each word cut through her like a blade. "So, I'm not really me?" "You're a part of her, Natalie," Richard said, his voice softer now. "Your memory reborn." "No," she screamed. "I'm a person. I have memories, feelings." "Memories can be copied," he said, eyes heavy. "But feelings, those are the only thing I couldn't control. That's why I came back, because you remembered things you weren't supposed to." Harriet stood, tears flooding her face. "You didn't come back for your family. You came to erase it again." Richard looked at her, his gaze worn and weary. "I came back to end it. There's no more Bell Street, Harriet. But they're trying to revive the project, and the girl, the one carrying faulty memory, is the key." "Mom, what's he saying?" Natalie asked, panicked. Harriet turned to her, eyes full of despair. "They'll come, Natalie. They'll want what's inside your head." "Inside my head?" "The real girl's memory." Rain slammed harder against the windows, 1,000 pounding fists. Outside, the distant sound of engines echoed tires on wet pavement. Someone was coming. Harriet rushed to the kitchen, pulled a small, dull metal gun from a lower drawer. Natalie stepped back, terrified. "Mom!" "It's not to kill anyone, sweetheart. It's to make sure they never take you again." Richard stepped forward, hands raised. "Harriet, don't. If you do this, it ends the wrong way." "No," she said, voice tight with grief. "It ended the wrong way 30 years ago." In that moment, everything froze. The rain, the ticking clock, the jasmine in the air, so thick it was hard to breathe. Harriet looked at Richard, then at Natalie. "You turned her into memory, Richard. But memory knows how to hurt." She pulled the trigger. The gunshot roared, drowning the thunder. The smell of gunpowder fused with jasmine, sharp, metallic, almost sweet. Richard crumpled, hands clutching his chest. Blood spread across the floor, mixing with liquid from the shattered perfume bottle on the table. The jasmine scent rose thick, stinging, almost burning. Natalie rushed forward, screaming, "No, no! You can't die again!" Richard's lips moved, voice barely a breath. "I was never alive, Natalie. Don't look for me in memory anymore. Live your own life." And then silence. His eyes closed. Outside, the rain stopped, leaving only the wind hissing through the open window. Harriet dropped the gun, covered her face, and collapsed. Natalie sank beside Richard's body, tears mixing with blood, her hands soaked in jasmine all the way to the bone. The scent would never leave her. When dawn came, the house was still. No police yet. Harriet sat by the window, gripping the silver ring, staring into the emptiness beyond. Natalie stood in the center of the room, silent, as if sound had vanished from the world. On the floor, between puddles of water and blood, the journal lay open to a new page. No one touched it, yet the pen trembled on its own fresh ink, spelling out words that faded with the mist. Silence ends when memory breathes again. 3 months later, winter arrived early. The city was blanketed in a thin layer of mist, and the streets held their breath in silence. Natalie stood in front of the empty lot where Bell Street Clinic once stood. The building was gone. All that remained was damp concrete and a warning sign: demolition complete, area restricted. In her hand was a silver ring, old, scratched, but the engraving inside was still clear. R to H, until silence. She turned the ring in her palm. The soft morning light reflected off the etched words, shimmering like a wound that refused to heal. Beside her was a newly placed memorial, no casket, no body, just an inscription. Richard Hale, 1957. Memory ends where love begins. Natalie placed the ring gently on the stone. A breeze passed, brushing her hair. The scent of jasmine lingered, faint but unmistakable. She closed her eyes. In her mind, Richard's voice echoed from afar. "Don't look for me in memory anymore." But memory doesn't wait to be found. It returns on its own. She went back to Harriet's old house. The door was still locked. Inside, dust covered everything, yet nothing had moved. The tea table, the clock, the journal, and the embroidered cloth with the letter N. On the table sat an envelope unmarked. She opened it. Inside was an old folded page, the handwriting immediately familiar. "Natalie, by the time you read this, I may be long gone. I couldn't stay in a house full of whispers. But don't be afraid of memory, darling. We can't erase it, only learn how to live with it. If you smell jasmine, don't think it's a haunting. It's your father's way of saying, memory is still breathing. Mom." Natalie folded the letter and held it in her hand for a long time. A single tear fell on the final line, blurring the ink like morning dew. Afternoon. The rain returned. Natalie sat in her car, watching Bell Street fade behind streaks of water on the windshield. Beside her, the journal lay open to its final page. Blank. She pulled out a pen and began to write, slowly. March 12th. Today, the scent of jasmine came back. But this time, it didn't scare me. She paused, listening to the rhythm of rain tapping on the roof. Outside, the wind carried jasmine from somewhere, not from any tree, not from perfume, but from the air itself, from fragments of memory lingering between people. A faint smile crossed her lips. She flipped the journal back to the first page, the one her mother once wrote, in delicate, steady handwriting. Memory never disappears. It only waits for someone to call its name. Night. Harriet's house stood quiet, bathed in moonlight filtering through the window. On the table, the journal lay open to its blank page. No one touched it, yet the pen rested beside it, tilted, trembling slightly as if brushed by air. Then, a new line began to appear, fresh ink blooming like a breath. I remember. The pen dropped. Silence. Only the wind moved, slipping through the cracks of the window, carrying a crisp scent of jasmine, a fragrance that no longer mourned. In the dim light, the words, "I remember," reflected softly on the window pane. Outside, someone stood still beneath the trees, tall, slender, draped in a dark coat. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply watched through the window, a quiet guardian of memory. The wind blew. The door creaked open. A single white jasmine petal fell onto the wooden floor, and then everything fell silent.